are about ready to start? I was going to just tell you something quick.
Right.
This mimer that we're working on about the garden.
Yes.
I love gardening.
Okay.
And I have a very small area, and I grow everything and anything. And when you explained about the mimer and Rabbi just put it on, I realized, oh my goodness, I'm doing something that's so it's makes me so happy, and now I know why it makes me so happy.
I'll have to send you a clip. I don't remember if I mentioned it last time. There's a beautiful sikha talk that's on video. I'd have to find it. Where the Rebbe very, very passionately talks about the world being God's orchard, God's garden. And that people might think that the world is a jungle, but it's absolutely not. We have to do our best to make sure that it's not a jungle, as well as not a jungle. This world is God's garden. And I was very, very passionate about it. It was very beautiful.
I'll look for it.
I'll have to see if I can find that.
Thank you.
So I figure I might as well take my own advice, and we'll start today with one of those classic jokes about a guy who's going to his future or his fiance's parents to meet them for the first time and ask them for the daughter's hand in marriage. And the father, of course, says, "Okay, what are you doing for livelihood?" And the boy, being a devout Jew, says, "God will provide, God will provide." And the future father-in-law kind of pushes, says, "What are you planning on doing? Do you have any skills? Do you have a degree? Do you have this, that, the other? God will provide, God will provide." Keeps one angle, the other angle, and the guy is absolutely stuck where he is. God will provide. Afterwards, the kids leave, and the parents are left with each other. The future mother-in-law says, "Nu, what do you think of the boy?" He says, well, the good news is he thinks I'm God."
Very good, very good. Thank you.
I thought we all feel that way.
All right, that has nothing to do with our subject. Well, I guess if we're talking about God in general, that has to do with our subject. But in any case, when we're talking about this concept of the garden, that the world was created in such a way that it was meant to be a place in which God could, so to speak, totally and absolutely reveal himself. There's no blockage whatsoever. Just completely incidentally, but because it has to do with the subject, we're going to talk about Adam and Eve prior to the sin. Of course, they had no clothes, because there was no sense of self, and there was no sense of negativity or anything like that. And Jewish thought explains, actually, that's the reason why intimacy must be done completely unclothed, because of the fact that it is a reversion to Adam and Eve before the sin. And that idea here is certainly the world right now is clothed in physicality in such a way that you see the physicality, you do not see the inner essence. And so those elements are some things that are very, very, very important when we think about our world at large. Because how do we define our world at large? How do we look at our world at large? And then how do we look at our personal world? How do we look at our, for the people that we interact with? If you use this idea that he's discussing here to reframe our interaction with the world, it really changes everything. Because then you see somebody not just as an opponent, not just as an adversary, not just as an annoying person, but as a person who is a godly soul that is struggling with their cover, with the concealment of godliness. And that allows you to be able to access the person in a much deeper way. or it allows you to be able to deal with the person in a much more compassionate way because of the fact that it's not my ego versus their ego. It's a recognition that everything is godly and there's concealment over the godliness that is the problem. So that is kind of a little bit of the takeaway from some of these ideas. They're very, very, very important. And they have a lot of power to them. And so we were about halfway down the chapter. We began with where we started saying this, but we want to focus on now. The beginning of the paragraph begins, now the ultimate purpose for the creation. The creation of the spiritual and physical worlds was that God desired to have a dwelling place in the lower worlds. That's what we're talking. So the previous Rebbe explains, he desired that divinity be revealed even on the material plane below by means of man's divine service of subordinating and transforming his physical nature. He desired that the divine soul descend from its spiritual heights and become clothed in a body with an animal soul, which would conceal and obscure the divine soul's light. And despite all this, through the study of Torah and the observance of the mitzvos, the divine soul would refine and purify the body and the animal soul, as well as its portion in the world, its environment. So the purpose is to deal with the world. And the purpose is not to find a mountaintop somewhere and meditate and kind of transcend in that kind of way. The purpose is to transcend within the world, in the experience of being a businessman, even in the experience of like we've discussed in terms of intimacy or other physical things. The purpose is to make that into a vehicle of godliness as opposed to allow that to drive a person. So all the animalistic tendencies can become godly if you're using them appropriately, if you're using them for the correct reason, if you're driving them with your godly soul. So if the direction is me first, in other words, taste, pleasure, interest, desire, those things first, then that's the animal soul driving things. And that any of those things are not necessarily evil, but they're just not being used appropriately. On the other hand, when we are allowing ourselves to access those things for a purpose, and we're not driving things with the pleasure first, the pleasure certainly comes from it. Like you said before, there's no question that there are a whole section of blessings that are meant to be said on pleasures, on pleasant scents, on pleasant, obviously, foods, on certain sites that you see that are remarkable or inspiring, or all of those things are referred to as birchot hanenim, the blessings of hana'ah, of pleasure. So Judaism doesn't say that you need to reject pleasure at all. The idea is that the pleasure should not be directing what we do. There's a great story to describe this of Rabbi Shmelka of Nikolsburg. He was a chassid of the Baal Shem Tov and a great Rebbe himself. And he once asked his gabbai, his secretary, to go get him a fruit, an apple, whatever it was. So the gabbai was a fairly simple Jew. He goes get an apple, and he gets himself an apple, and he sits down, and the two of them make a blessing, and he's eating the apple, and the Rebbe is eating the apple, and he turns and he thinks to himself, what's the difference between me and the Rebbe? Both of us are eating the apple. And suddenly the Rebbe turns to him and says, what's the difference between me and you? Both of us are here eating this apple. And he says, Rebbe, I was just thinking of that same question. The Rebbe says, I'll tell you what the difference is. When you want an apple, you go get an apple, you make a bracha, and you eat the apple, right? He says, of course. He says, when I want to make a bracha, I go get an apple. So that's indicative of somebody whose drives have been subordinated. They've been driven to the point where the decisions are godly first. We oftentimes basically just we say the bracha in order to get to the food, and he's getting the food in order to say the bracha. So that's obviously a very, very high level of it, but to some degree, every single one of us can apply this just as well, just as easily. So he continues this and says, this then is the meaning of the above quoted verse. V'asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham, and they shall make me a sanctuary, and I shall dwell within them, within each individual Jew. He says the individual brings about this revelation of the divine presence of the Shekhinah within his personal sanctuary, within himself, through his divine service of sifting and refining materiality, by subordinating and transforming his physical nature. So the physical nature now is no longer driven by what I want, even what I need. It's driven by my godly purpose. An animal is stuck within its own framework. There are animals that, of course, are intelligent. There's no question about it. But each animal cannot elevate itself beyond its own framework. So a beaver, as creative, as incredible as they are in terms of creating dams and their ability to be able to engineer these really, really fascinating structures, it will never be able to recreate, it will never be able to create something new besides for that which it was given the capability of doing. So it will create dams. That's what they do. A human being, on the other hand, has the ability to be able to break out of any of our limitations, so to speak, and we're able to create new substances. We're able to go beyond. Of course, a human being as an animal is an air-breathing animal and can only therefore swim in the water for a certain amount of time. So we created scuba diving. We created submarines in order to be able to go beyond those capabilities, to be able to explore, to go places where human beings cannot go. We are not capable of leaving the ground because we do not fly. So we created machines that allow us to fly. We are stuck inside this planet, and so therefore we created machines to bring us out of this planet. So we have the ability to be able to transcend, and that's not just true with regards to mechanical things, but it's true within ourselves. So even though we have drives one way or the other, we have the ability to be able to take those drives and focus them, or to be able to transform those drives into something else. It could be a tremendous amount of work, but it just needs to be done. That's part of who we are. And when we do that, there's a tremendous effect. Go ahead, Robert.
I don't mean to interview, but in the text here, when we read the phrase divine light, the divine illumination, I mean, when you talk about animals or any other quote unquote beings on earth, anywhere else, the human who we are, as we were created by Hashem, are the only ones that can then ostensibly understand what the divine light is and the illumination of Hashem. And everything else is subordinate to us because just by their being, I think that is a very important understanding of who we are in our relationship to Hashem and our physicality and, again, intellectual state here on this planet, let's call it, okay?
Absolutely, without a question. Animals are they have a soul, but their soul is much more concealed, and their soul is only stuck within a particular framework. And what we're saying is that every single one of us has the ability to be able to rise above that framework.
Right, and that frame being the Sitra Achra, right? I mean, ostensibly the animal within us.
Correct. That's
okay.
Absolutely correct. So when the scientists say that the human being is an animal, on a very basic level, they are correct, but they are incorrect in thinking that the human being remains an animal. We have the ability to be able to live 90 years and be an animal throughout those years, somebody who just simply goes after their own desires, goes after their animalistic attitudes in life. Or you have the ability to be able to transcend and to be able to create something, to be able to do something godly, to be able to impact people, to be able to certainly transform the world in a godly way through Torah and mitzvot. And that is not animalistic at all. And that's completely beyond. But every single time we are faced up with the klipa, with the sitra achra, with the spirit of animalistic tendencies, with the spirit of negativity, and every single time we make a choice to push that away, we make a tremendous impact. And that's not something that's recognized here. And that's what he says, in this spirit is written, when the sitra achra, the cosmic force opposing holiness, is subdued, the glory of God rises thereby and is diffused throughout all the worlds. This is a very, very, very important line. Every single time I make a decision that goes against what my animalistic tendencies want, I create a joy in God that completely transcends the worlds. And that's what we're going to talk about here. And so that simple choice, whether it's a choice that basically, okay, I have the choice to sit down and study something, or I have the choice to go onto YouTube. And I make the choice, you know what, I'm going to learn something. When I make that choice, it's not just a little thing inside me, it is makes a huge difference. Now, if I'm a person who is by nature attracted to studying Torah, and so therefore the choice is really not much of a choice, then obviously the impact is not that great. But the more my interest is in what I'm pushing myself away from, the greater the impact.
Well, can I ask this then? Those of us who are in class, because you then become the master of this class, and each one of us have chosen to be part of this class because of the enlightenment that we're able to then understand, grow with, separates us out from others. Is that something that can be said and accepted?
Well, here we have to be very careful, because we can only apply this to ourselves.
Right,
To
okay.
other people, we don't know their struggles. So we don't know their systems and the internal choices. So this is very, very much something that I need to apply to myself. And I can't judge other people based on this, because I see what my struggles are, and I see my ability to be able to say yes or no. But when I think about this, it obviously gives me a greater interest in making the right decisions. And so that's the reason why it's really, really important. But the previous Rebbe explains this quote from the Zohar, and he says, when the phrase throughout all the worlds is used by the Zohar, it intends to describe a level of divine light that is diffused equally in all worlds, which is Sovev Kol Almin. And of course, we discussed Sovev in the past. We explained that there's a transcendent light and there's an absorbent light. The transcendent light is Sovev, and it is the great equalizer. It is as God is completely beyond the worlds, and all worlds are the same. There's no difference between an ant and Atzilut. Everything is totally and absolutely, really, as it were nothing, so to speak. Memale, on the other end, enlivens every single detail in its particular framework, in its particular world, with its particulars, both physical and characteristics and all that. So when we talk about this transcendence, we're not talking about the transcendence just, oh, well, it's nice, but we're talking about Sovev Kol Almin is diffused throughout all the worlds. And that's a tremendous idea. And he explains, the spiritual worlds exist at various levels. In the higher realms, the divine light shines forth in overt revelation, while in the lower world realms, the revelation is not as apparent. At certain levels, the light is even hidden and obscured. Of course, Atzilus, as we've explained, is a dimension in which everything is pure godliness. There is no other there. It's just godly. On the other hand, the lower worlds, there are beings, whether they're angels. Angels might be very godly in terms of being very spiritual, but they have an expression of otherness. And that otherness means that there's an element of non-godliness. There's an element of personality and self. And anytime there's self involved, that is something that differentiates itself from godliness. So obviously you have higher levels and you have lower levels. And this is an idea that the Medrash, as he continues here, he says the Medrash refers to this variety of levels in its comment on the verse. My hand established the earth and my right hand spanned the heavens. The Medrash declares he stretched out his right hand and created the heavens. He stretched out his left hand and created the earth. Now God obviously does not have hands. There's no physicality involved in here. There's no description. Anytime you give some kind of descriptive element of God, it's a qualitative or conceptual idea. It is absolutely not a physical idea. And the Rebbe explains, as is known, the right hand signifies a greater light and more overt revelation than does the left. And that's the reason why among Chassidim, the right is always placed over the left. If you've ever wondered why the rabbi's jacket is backwards. But the right signifies chesed and greater revelation. The left signifies gevura, which is withdrawal. And so the right hand created the heavens, signifying higher spiritual realms, where the divine light is both more intense and more revealed. Chesed. Chesed is revelation, openness, giving, kindness. The left hand, by contrast, created the earth, signifying the lower spiritual realms, where the divine light is both less intense and more concealed. The left hand is, of course, gvura, which we explained means literally severity, but it's withdrawal, it's discipline, it's very specific. And the Rebbe continues and explains this idea. He says this concept can be grasped more completely through the comprehension of the differences between the four spiritual realms alluded to in the verse. All that is called by my name, it is for my glory that I created it, formed it, and indeed made it. Because there's one of these psukim out there that seems very, very poetic, but what does it mean? So the Rebbe explains that these four words allude in descending order to the four worlds, to the four stages in the creative process. Atzilus, Bria, Yitzira, and Asiya. Atzilus, as we explained, is the highest of the worlds. So the matter of illumination in Atzilus differs from that in the other three worlds. For in Atzilus, that divine energy which had been concealed becomes revealed. Significantly, the word Atzal of the Hebrew word Atzilus has two very different meanings, next to and separate. They're exact opposites. What does this mean? And we'll go back and explain it in just a moment. On the one hand, Atzilus is separate enough from its source to be categorized as a world. On the other hand, it never ceases to be one of the infinite worlds of the Ein Sof. And so we're explaining here is that Atzilus has two opposite dimensions to it. On the one hand, it is a world. A world is not a planet, but like we said, it's a dimension of creation. And in Atzilus, the experience is one of etzel, samuch, close to, proximity, because its proximity to godliness is overt and obvious. But at the exact same time, because it is a defined dimension, that's what makes it into a world. It is the concealment of God, the word olam from the word helem, which means concealment, that creates a world, and even Atzilus with its proximity is some element of concealment. But the difference between Atzilus, as we'll see, and the other three worlds is that in Atzilus, everything is totally unified and feels nothing but godliness, feels total connection, and there's no self whatsoever expressed in Atzilus. And the world's Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya, which we will see in just a moment, there is a sense of self. There is a sense of differentiation, even though those are very, very high levels. Gan Eden is in Bria. Heaven, as we refer to it, is in Bria. It's in a world in which the souls can express themselves without feeling completely unified with God. Is it godly? Is it spiritual? Is it heavenly? Absolutely, without question. But there's still a sense of self. And that's what the Rebbe says over here. This is not so with the case of Bria. There we see the beginnings of seemingly independent existence, the creation of something from nothing. Now, there's something else. There's differentiation. And so he goes back to the pasuk that we had just before. He says, in the above quoted verse, the phrases, my name and my glory, signify a state of being that is still at one with its divine source. They thus refer to the world of Atzilus, which is still integrally united with its source, a world in which the divine light shines forth in utter revelation. The concealment in Atzilus is only the fact that it is a defined world. It is a defined dimension. That is the only element of concealment that's there, because there has to be some kind of limitation in order to be able to have this particular world. And you think about it this way, Ora Ein Sof is God's infinite light or infinite energy. So God has infinite possibilities. He chooses one system, and that by its nature conceals the rest of infinity. And that's basically what's going on with the Atzilus. And the Rebbe goes down and says, what about the other three worlds? The divine revelation in the other three worlds is very different, in as much as they are creations and hence perceive themselves as having an identity distinct from that of their source. So again, sense of self. Moreover, as their separate names indicate, Bria, creation, Yitzira, formation, Asiya, action, these are differences in the degree of light received by each. So we're seeing this downward progression, which is, of course, the purpose of these four worlds. This differentiation, however, which varies in the absorbed, capacity of each realm, is true only of that manner of divine revelation that animates the various worlds imminently. This kind of light is called Mamale Kalaman, that which fills the worlds, which is basically the fact is that each world receives according to its capacity of receiving. But there's another kind of light, which is Soviv, a light that is oblivious to the particular limitations of the various realms. Transcending them all, it illuminates them equally. This kind of light is called Soviv Kalaman. And pardon me for moving quickly through the end of this chapter, because I really wanted to finish this chapter this week. When the above mentioned quotation spoke of the glory of God rising and being God infused throughout the worlds, it was speaking of this kind of light, Soviv, which is absorbed by all worlds equally. If this light is to be elicited and drawn to all the worlds, man must labor at his task of sifting and refining materiality, and by subordinating and transforming its physical nature. And this is what is meant by the above statement from the Zohar. When the Sitra Achara is subdued, when by laboring at his divine service, a Jew subjugates the forces of unholiness and darkness, and darkness is transformed into light, the ensuing light is superior because it issues from the darkness. As a result of the concealment itself, there is greater intensity. There's something which is naturally luminescent, is not spiritually luminescent, is not nearly as powerful as something that is not naturally luminescent, and finds it within itself. So just moving down, it says, this is explained above is what we meant by the verse, and and they shall make for me a sanctuary, and I shall dwell within them, within each individual Jew, through his work, through his avodah, and the divine service of subjugating his physical nature and transmuting darkness into light. In this way, the resultant light is enhanced, and the glory of God rises throughout the world, because Soviv Kolamin is thereby revealed. When will it truly be revealed in this world? Of course, that's only Mashiach. But we are beginning that process right now. Every single time we are faced with darkness, every single time we're faced with some kind of negativity, whether it's overt negativity, we're desiring to eat lobster today or something like that, or whether it's less overt negativity, just simply animalistic desires, interests that are inappropriate, or even interests that need to be guided in a particular way in a particular time. Any of those decisions where we make the right decision causes this tremendous energy of Soviv Kolamin to be revealed within the world, because now the person has transcended his experience. He is no longer just a physical being. The food that he eats for the purpose of godliness is no longer just something that's meant to fill his stomach, something meant to make him feel good, but now he has, and especially making a bracha on it reveals what the purpose of that food was. And as a result of that driving divinity, we cause this ultimate revelation. So that idea is going to be explored into the next chapter, God willing.
Rabbi, I have a question, but
yes.
I don't want to take up the time to give me an answer now. I'll just ask the question. Maybe you can answer later. How are people to understand the idea of these worlds, which are spiritual, but they seem to be inanimate objects? How are they having a sense of self or not having a sense of self? But you can answer the next question, because next class, because I don't want to take up the time. But that's my question.
Thank you, David, for being so considerate.
I have a short question.
Yeah, go ahead.
But that's from the first page.
Go ahead.
You're saying that because God said Lgani and not Lgan, it means it's a bridal chamber. How do you get from that to a bridal chamber?
Gani, so it becomes Gnuni. Gnuni means a bridal chamber.
Ginuni?
It's not a typical word that's used. That's what the measure says, that is referencing this term Ginuni. And Reb David, that is an idea which simply answered with regards to the beings in each world, so to speak. The separateness is something that is an idea that is expressed even in spiritual dimensions. But it needs a better answer than that. So I'll have to really think about how that works. So thank you. Have a wonderful Shabbos, everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.